Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is the type of video that I really don't like making, which is basically a sort of obituary of sorts, because we've lost one of the truly great legends in cinema who was still with us. And that, of course, is the news of the recent passing of the legend Roger Corman, who was known for, of course, being the king of Bs or B films and for being responsible for what's known as the Roger Corman Film School. But his legacy goes far beyond even those sort of credits, because he was one of the rare people in the industry who had integrity and a sense of, honestly, it's a sense of personal warmth and intelligence that always came through, even in low-budget genre films that he made and, of course, pioneered. And it's really that sort of, I mean, he really represented the ultimate expression of a DIY aesthetic of independent production, and then getting in essentially with a bunch of the smaller distribution outfits that were starting up, because he came along at about the right time in the early to mid 1950s when that became more of a possibility with the changing aspects of film distribution, and in particular the emergence of different circuits, especially things like the drive-in circuit, and needing more programmer titles to fill double bills, and also catering to certain markets and basically films that were trying to exploit them, especially the emerging teenage market. So I think most people and most film fans are obviously aware of Corman as the sort of master of this form, but he had tried essentially to work in the studio system before that, and seems to have instinctively realized that it wasn't really getting him anywhere. It wasn't really for him, and he needed some sort of different outlet. Similarly, as before he decided to get into the film industry, he had tried being an engineer and realized very quickly that wasn't for him, and found what he really wanted to do is be involved in film production, and then eventually turned his hand to directing after working in studio mailrooms and getting involved in script development and then writing scripts. And even there, if you look at the first films that he started to work on or write and then eventually direct, I think you can see what his greatest talent was, which was finding and highlighting talent and championing people. And that gets into what's known as the Roger Corman Film School. But even in his earliest films, they are usually featuring people on both sides of the camera who were great talents, but not your A-list top-tier stars or people who were the top of the list for various categories. But there's always this sense of trying to champion people and find diamonds in the rough or emerging talents, as he would do so many times throughout the intervening years with so many names that are big names now. That's really where they got their first opportunity to essentially hone their craft, whether it was Francis Ford Coppola or Joe Dante or or Scorsese or all these different people, and of course actors too. It really was a film school of sorts, and this was not something that Corman really trumpeted about to try and make himself look better or something. It was just something that he naturally did, and I think it grew out of his own desire to do what was, at least felt like important work, and make pictures that actually had some genuine entertainment, but also at least some sense of merit. And of course, we're also successful, because that's what any film has to be, is successful, because you don't want anyone to lose their money. But again, it was this sense of championing people and talent and encouraging that, even if they were working ridiculously tight schedules. And Corman could, make a film, legendarily make a film out of seemingly nothing. As for example, when he had basically 2 extra days of time with Boris Karloff while they were making The Raven, he was able to use those 2 extra days and turn it into an entire feature film, which turned out to be The Terror, which was also giving a young Jack Nicholson a shot at more creative input. So you can't look at a Corman film and not see some point where there's either a famous name who's up and coming getting a chance to do something, or a particular person in the cast or crew who is at least being given some sort of spotlight or support to do really interesting work. It didn't matter if it was a genre picture with a non-existent budget that was, obviously a exploitation 50s monster picture with a very with a very obviously very cheap production values. It was the spirit of the thing that really came across, and I think a lot of that came from Corman himself, because just in interviews and in his writings, his book is of course indispensable and a must read. And you just always get this sense of this positivity and this incredible spirit, and it was always there in his eyes. Anytime you see him in interviews, or just anytime you even see a photo of Corman or something, there's always this spirit behind the eyes. And I think that speaks volumes, along with studying his career and how he always championed people. And he was very smart to do this, because having no budget and having no time, you have to work with what you have, and your greatest commodity is the people that surround you. And there's this sort of can-do attitude that permeates the Corman films. And if you read people's recollections of these films, they all say the same thing. We would do things for Roger Corman we wouldn't do for anybody else. We would work long days. We would not be getting paid anything, but we all felt like we were invested in something and doing something, and we would do that for him, because we knew that it meant something, and we wanted to all do well. And Corman did eventually work his way back into the studio system at various times, and tried to make feature films for major studios, but it never really took off. And how his career developed basically helped him find his niche, which was in independent production and working directly with smaller distributors. And he was right in there in terms of being just at the right time in the 1950s. And of course, some of his work, one of his directed films became the first film of what eventually became American International Pictures. Of course, it wasn't named that at the start, but it was really his partnership with AIP that was the most produced the most fruitful collaborations. And that's what eventually led to his greatest artistic success, I think, and his most iconic works, which is the Poe cycle. And that entirely came out of Corman being tired of making low budget, very short schedule horror exploitation films for particular markets, and deciding he wanted to do something that, for lack of a better term, was maybe a little bit artier and had some more intellectual merit to it, and also, at least have a little bit more time and maybe shoot in color. So he went to AIP and basically, was like, what if we took the production value essentially for two of these cheap films we've been cranking out, and what if we sort of combined them and made one film that was in color and actually in a widescreen aspect ratio and had a bit more production value, and let's get an actual star of some renown. And I've always loved Poe, and the idea to adapt a Poe story means that you have that immediate sort of credit of having literary merit, and you could then actually have the film play in other circles. But he wasn't content to simply stop there, because then you have to look at the cast and crew he assembled for what was still a very small production on a very short schedule that most other people couldn't have pulled off. It wasn't just securing Vincent Price and basically giving him the run of roles in the Poe cycle that became really the iconic idea we have of Vincent Price that immortalized him as the screen legend that he is. But it's also getting Floyd Crosby as his cinematographer, who is one of the great cinematographers who never really got a ton of credit, and was apparently also, at least to some extent, blacklisted. and had worked for Murnau and had shot High Noon. And so you've got an incredible cinematographer who then makes your small picture look like $10 million dollars when you're having to squeeze pennies together wherever possible. And also getting Richard Matheson to write the screenplay. So, or right there are two examples of how Corman was absolutely a genius in not only finding and securing talent, but also shepherding talent. And that, I think, is what was his greatest gift as a director or a producer or in a creative capacity. And the film still had that positive attitude of that we can do this, while maintaining that do-it-yourself aesthetic that you can only do outside of the studio system. And having a bit more production value, a bit more money, at least a little bit more time for a little bit more breathing room means that the Poe films are the works that have the most staying power, and that's why they basically became iconic when they were released and instigated a whole new realm of the horror genre, and of course a lot of imitators. This spawned the overall cycle of films in the series because House of Usher was extremely successful in 1960, and of course AIP wanted more. But to Corman's credit, he wasn't one to rest on his laurels, and you can see that over the films he was kind of chafing under that after really 2 or 3 films especially. So he started trying to do other things within the confines of the cycle, and you can see that he was in ways there was a creative spark that he was trying to nurture. So in the Poe films they wound up trying anthology films, and then of course they did a Lovecraft film that then AIP basically retitled and acted like it was a Poe film, and eventually they moved into comedy with The Raven and then the offshoot Comedy of Terrors that Jacques Tourneur directed. So you can see even in Corman's most famous and most renowned and most iconic films that there's a sense of trying to maintain that creative spark and do things that are different while still knowing that this is what's selling now, and we've got to keep making hit films to keep the money rolling in, to keep the lights on. So, but even there's a sense of trying to not let the creative spark go out. And that's the thing that I think gets lost a lot of times in looking at Corman's career as king of the B films and making all of these famous genre films, that you've got somebody who was an intelligent person. He had studied English literature. He had lived abroad. He had a variety of different experiences, but also had experience in engineering, and I think applied some of that to how he made films and I think that's how he could keep to such short schedules and be extremely efficient and work extraordinarily quickly, and also encourage everybody else to sort of get in that mentality and get to the same speed level of production and use every bit of material or everything they had laying around with what meager resources they had to put it all up on the screen. But this also meant that he did try to get important themes and important subject matters into films, or even make films about important subject matters. The biggest example of this would be The Intruder, which is a very early starring vehicle for William Shatner, and it's all about the civil rights movement. Essentially, it's on a subject matter level, it's the most important film Corman ever made, and the fact that he even got it made or dared to make it and actually got it finished and released in a time that that was not subject matter that any studio would go near, and it was very unsuccessful at the box office. It was not something that he was really able to try again. He did at least manage to make a film like that at that time in the early 1960s and actually mean it and have that intelligent thought behind it and push it through to actually get the financing and get it made and go shoot it in areas where you didn't really want people to know that you were making a civil rights film, because he was shooting in places where there were people who didn't exactly agree with that, and it was a film that was very difficult to make, and he made it. And I think that film shows most of all that there was always an attempt to have merit, but he knew that the primary goal of any film was to entertain and to make money. And so if you were having important themes, you had to find ways to work them into entertainment values, essentially. You couldn't be so on the nose and have a message picture. There were at least attempts throughout his filmography to have films like that, or at least have films with themes that were important. But essentially, after his time at AIP and after the Poe cycle, he did eventually go back to trying to work in the studio system and directed a variety of films that really show, I think, that his perfect niche was having that time at AIP where he was doing what he had done in the 50s, but having a bit more money and a little bit more time, a little bit more scale, essentially, but not being within the confines of a studio. So he basically directed his last feature film for some time in 1971 and switched mostly entirely to producing. But also, he was continuing to champion future talent, and that's where the Corman Film School really took off in terms of all of these bigger names who were nobodies at the time, essentially getting their first crack at having an opportunity to work and develop their own talents on various Corman projects, whether it was in production or even Joe Dante and others started by cutting trailers for Corman films. And Corman ran a variety of companies as producer and distributor throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, basically all the way up until now. But he also was one of the greatest champions for foreign cinema, because he actually ran a distribution company that was buying the rights to foreign films by important directors and actually getting them legitimate distribution in the U.S. and receiving great profits from doing so. So actually getting them in circulation and supporting them far more than usually what most major studios would do when they picked up a foreign film and just kind of sort of did like a half-hearted distribution of it. And those films were, of course, a lot of times winning best foreign film. But so essentially he was, championing Bergman works, Fellini works, Truffaut works, and this went on for a great amount of time. That's how he wound up, for example, being the person consulted here in the U.S. During the struggle to get The Wicker Man released in its original form. And fortunately the longer version that he was sent to essentially to review for giving advice on U.S. distribution, that's what survived and helped to at least reconstruct the one of the longer versions of the film. So his influence is far greater than most people realize, because you can draw all these connecting lines, not just in terms of people and talents and their careers, but also to other films and as a producer and really as a distributor as well. So he wound up being one of the great champions of foreign cinema and what would be termed art cinema. And most people would never make that connection that the king of the bees, as he was known, was also one of the great champions of art cinema. So Corman was really somebody who I think never gave up on the power and the promise of cinema, and obviously had a lifelong love of the medium. And he continued as a producer and by running various companies, and essentially moved more into basically more of television films and direct-to-video releases, and through various companies and forms, again, continued this basically all the way up until his passing just now. So he was not someone to rest on his laurels. And another thing is that with the rise of home video and film culture, and actually studying films and catalog titles and productions and film history, he became became somebody who actively supported this and would give countless interviews and do Q&A sessions and participate in the home video releases of his films for interviews. He did commentaries and was really one of our sort of living treasures in terms of somebody who had such an incredible and long and varied body of work in many different aspects of film production, and could recount all these anecdotes and stories, and was not only willing to do so, but seemed to understand how important that was to not only encourage people to look at films more seriously and care about the filmmaking process, but also the history of the medium and how much work and effort of all the various different people went into these. And in doing all of this, I think it just confirmed the sense you always got of his commitment to the medium. And again, you just always get that sense of what an incredible positive person he was. And how supportive that somebody like that could be for so many people. And once you consider that, it just makes perfect sense why there was a Roger Corman film school, why so many people managed to build a career out of essentially feeling like they had that support of somebody saying, you can do this. And I have to think that was coming out of Corman's early experiences in the studio industry, kind of looking for that and not necessarily getting that, and then moving into independent production and sort of kind of doing that on his own as he went along, just naturally. But it's just one of those losses that really hits you, because the more you learn about Corman, and the more you would see him in interviews, and the more films of his you would see, and just admiring his commitment and his sort of can-do attitude all those years, and then continuing after essentially stepping away from the director's chair and continuing to produce and run companies and be a film distributor and still going in various forms as the distribution landscape changed over and over and over again. Never resting on his laurels and writing a memoir and participating in the rediscovery of his own films and being such an incredibly warm and generous person. Just that all that comes across without ever knowing the person or meeting them. All of that just comes across. I think anybody will get that. So this is one of the losses that really hits hard. And he is the type of person that we simply won't see the likes of again. He was an original, and his greatest legacy is championing so many talents in ways. It's having a legacy that continues time and time again, because you just look at if there was like a genealogy chart of all of the people who he worked with or championed or inspired in some way, shape, or form, it just goes and goes and goes and branches off. And you have to think that sort of positivity and generating of support in a creative sense, that just goes through the others that he influenced, and the chart of the genealogy tree would just keep branching off and off and off and off through, generation after generation after generation of new talent. So that is without question his greatest legacy, but also for in a lot of ways being one of the bedrocks of the development of independent cinema and genre cinema, of course, and always having that positive spirit and that can-do attitude that shone through, even if the films themselves at times were extremely low budget exploitation pictures that were they obviously were what they were. But I think that that quality, that sort of plucky can-do attitude always shines through. So for me, Roger Corman has always been one of the most inspirational people to study in terms of wanting to get into the film business, or wanting to direct or make your own films, because here's somebody who did that time and time again and didn't have the support of the studio system, and managed to find ways around that, and managed to a lot of times make something out of nothing. And there's nothing more inspirational than that. So for anyone curious about Corman's career, or learning more, the best place to start is, of course, his book. This is the first edition of, How I Made 100 Movies in Hollywood and Never Lost a Dime. That's a title if there ever was one for a film memoir. There are later editions, and I think a slightly expanded later edition as well. So this is one of the invaluable film memoirs. It's very inexpensive, and I'm definitely going to be rereading this now. But this is the perfect place to go if you want to know more about Corman, or if you want to revisit his career and body of work, as you should. Going back to his filmography, of course, his most famous films over the course of his career are the most seen, most discussed, basically really starting with a Bucket of Blood in 1959 and going on from there. But it's the Edgar Allan Poe cycle for AIP that is the most iconic. And I think they represent the best of Corman's films, and sort of having a focusing of all of his strengths, and having a bit more production value, and really engaging the creative side of things, and working with some of the greatest works of literature ever written. And there's a sort of synergy there, and you get to see different approaches taken. So it's not just doing the same thing over and over again. If I had to choose a favorite, or the Corman film that I think is not only firing on all cylinders, but really is probably the overall peak, or the strongest overall for different aspects, is probably The Pit and the Pendulum, which is the second of the Poe cycle, and it builds on all of the strengths and the great aspects of House of Usher, which was the first in the series, which, again, it was never intended to be a series at all. So that's the film that I think is probably the best Corman film overall, in terms of representing all of his strengths as a director and producer, and having that can-do attitude. And they got a little bit more money to play with. The sets are a bit more elaborate, because they got to reuse all the sets from Usher they already had. So they basically built off the success of that film, and built off of the physical aspects of that film too. So it's basically like a version 2.0 and super version of House of Usher, and they also have a little bit of fun with it, and they push a lot of the horror aspects. So it's in some ways a breakthrough for certain elements of the genre, and being a bit more daring, while still being a Poe adaptation. So they get that literary cachet, essentially, so they could sell it as a Poe film. So that for me is probably my favorite Corman film overall. And the most opulent would be when he went to England for the last two of the Poe cycle, Mask of the Red Death and Tomb of Ligeia. But Mask of the Red Death is the most opulent and the most visually striking of the Poe series, and probably the most visually striking Corman-directed film. And it was shot by the legendary cameraman Nicholas Roeg before he became a director. And in England, that they could basically make the dollar go further, and they were able to reuse sets from Beckett. So it is a unbelievably striking film that you can see Corman being able to do more in England, in terms of getting even more production value out of what was still a relatively meager budget. So it's a great time to revisit the Poe cycle and study how that series developed, and how Corman tried different things, and he tried to not just get typed or pigeonholed into just repeating himself over and over again. And I think studying the Poe cycle is a great a sort of distillation of how his career went and all the different things he tried, and I think that's why they remain the most iconic and most famous and best of his directorial career overall, while still having one foot obviously in being genre films for AIP, so they fit with his other films. I would also suggest people checking out The Intruder, which again is the most hard hitting and serious film that Corman ever made. But there are so many other beloved classics and fun genre films that Corman did. The Man with X-Ray Eyes is another favorite. Of course, the entirety of the Poe series. There's just such a wealth of films that Corman either directed or produced or wrote or was involved with or distributed, and then of course just kept going. So he never stopped, and this means that the releases and home video versions and masters and of all of the films that are under the Corman umbrella are varied in terms of being under different studios, different distributors, different labels, different states of preservation. But thankfully nowadays there are solid or very good versions available of his more famous films and most of the films like the Poe cycle. So you do have to sort of jump around in terms of getting US releases, UK boutique label releases, and then trying to find all the supplements, of which there are some really fantastic ones. Probably my favorite is the fact that Corman actually did an audio commentary for Pit and the Pendulum, so that in and of itself is a treasure. For the Poe films, of course, you have the Shout Factory releases here in the US and the Vincent Price collection volumes, and these are really solid editions with some nice supplements and are basically working off of the master materials that MGM has had done for years. But if you can, or you have the ability, I think they are outdone slightly by the Arrow Video renderings in the UK. I just have the standard editions. Kino Lorber has done some of the other films like The Premature Burial, but overall, I think the Arrow releases are still the primary go-to versions for almost all of the films. The only one that's got of the Poe series that's gotten a modern restoration is, of course, Mask of the Red Death, which has the Studio Canal release in Europe, and then Shout Factory reissued the Vincent Price Volume 1 set, which I have here, which has the new restoration of Mask of the Red Death, which also has the all-important alternate version, which actually restores footage that was cut from the film, so it's actually the uncut version. And before this restoration, the only way you could see the uncut version was actually on the widescreen Laserdisc I have here. So that's why this was my go-to version of the film for some time. But it's at least great we have the films available and in circulation with nice supplements. And there's a whole variety of DVD and Blu-ray releases of Corman titles. So you can have a field day really of just going through all the different films and just trying to see the history of his career and all the different films he was involved with in some capacity, even if they weren't directed by him. So this is just a very loose sort of general thoughts and reaction, and again, this is the kind of piece you hope you never have to make, but I felt the need to say something because obviously Corman was such an incredible force in the cinematic world for so many decades, but he's been somebody who's been very inspirational, not just to me, but to countless people for the entirety of his film career. But I've been interested and inspired by Roger Corman ever since I was a kid, and I first saw one of the Poe films, and I started seeing interviews that Corman would do, and then getting later releases, and then being able to see the supplements and see him talk directly about the films and start I started digging into his career and seeing his other films, and was just struck by the positive can-do attitude he always had, and the incredible ability he had to make films out of nothing with no schedules and no money whatsoever. And then all the various paths his career took, and then the championing of so many other talents, and it's just such a remarkable body of work, and such a remarkable career that this is obviously somebody who was one of a kind, and a complete original, and there's never been and never will be anybody else like Roger Corman. So that's why I felt the need to do this, and I just hope I can encourage or inspire others to look closely at Corman's incredible and varied long-running career, and hopefully also be inspired by some of his incredible achievements. And whether that's just looking at the Poe cycle, or going beyond, or his famous genre films, or 1950s low-budget exploitation films or horror films, essentially there's not an aspect of his career that isn't inspirational to all of us who aspire to work in the film industry. There's always something there that is inspirational to anyone who wants to get into film production, or anyone who's ever worked in film production can recognize that. That's why I wanted to at least put something together, because this is one of the losses that definitely hits hard, and he really was one of our living treasures in terms of living cinema legends. So absolutely go and check his memoir out, How I Made 100 Movies in Hollywood and Never Lost a Dime. Again, it's gone through several editions. It's very easily available, very inexpensive, and it's one of the memoirs that definitely needs to be read and go on your film shelf if you have a film book library. And then, of course, dig into the various myriad of really wonderful physical media releases of Corman films, especially the Poe films most of all, and then look at the incredible supplements that go along with them, especially the ones that Corman actually participated in. So again, this has just been my own sort of personal reaction to the news, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about how Corman's work and overall approach and career has been an influence to me ever since I was a kid and first saw the Poe films, and how I'm just a sort of very tiny example of how he did that for so many people. And that's just something you don't see. It's not something that people do in the film industry, especially. So there definitely needs to be more of that, and one can only hope that Corman's influence and can hopefully provide an example for other people to follow in his footsteps in that area, because there's such a lack of that. And that's certainly Roger Corman's greatest legacy, and one can only hope that more people will be inspired by that and try to continue that type of creative goodwill, because we certainly need that. So again, certainly go and check out more of Corman's filmography, read his memoir. I know I'm going to be doing the same, as I think all Corman fans are. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.